Hello there, historians. Today we're going to take a look at early modern Europe, focusing in on Eastern and Western European development from 1450 to 1750. Now, the focus of this is going to be more of a chronological history, so we're going to take a look at each region within a 50-year time at the same time, so that you have a clear understanding of what's going on in Western Europe and what's going on in Eastern Europe at the same time. To try to keep it even, I am going to use blue for Western Europe and green for Eastern Europe. So if I end up not keeping it to the side that it belongs, at least you could follow along with color. So let's keep going. So what are some of the main changes and continuities from the post-classical period? To keep the list short, I'll just do a few for each. First, with the changes. One of the key changes in this period of time is the growth of what we call a global economy, an economy that for the first time isn't just Afro-Eurasia, but includes the Americas. This is due to a lot of different reasons, but focused mostly on the Atlantic slave trade, the triangular trading network that connects east to west, or at least the New World to the Old World, bringing with it all kinds of new forms of labor organization, new political governments, a mercantile-style system, new goods, you name it. With the Atlantic slave trade, like I just mentioned, we also see the rise of new forms of labor. From the encomienda in the New World to the rise of serfdom, or at least the continued use of serfdom at a more intensified rate, we see new forms of labor popping up. The biggest one, of course, being the use of African slaves on plantations in the New World for things like sugar, coffee, and cotton production. And one last big change from Unit 3 to Unit 4, from the post-classical period to the early modern period, would be new forms of government. Now, in Western Europe, we're going to see things like the Enlightenment, and in Eastern Europe, although the Enlightenment is recognized, it's not utilized. One thing that we do see in both East and Western Europe is the rise of absolute monarchies. Monarchies run by one person who claims absolute power over his dominion. Examples in the West would be Frederick the Great of Prussia and King Louis XIV, Mr. Sun King of France. And in the East, of course, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great can be considered absolute monarchs. They are part of the Romanov dynasty. Now, some of the continuities that we see from Unit 3 to 4, which is the post-classical period to the early modern period, is religion. The main religions in each period, in each area don't change. In the West, we still have Catholicism, and in the East, we still have Orthodoxy. So while there are more challenges significantly to culture, society, and politics, those religions don't really see that much of a change. Now, in the West, although Catholicism stays a main religion, we do see some serious switching up and at least some allegiance changing over to different Protestant faiths, but generically speaking, Christianity does not change as the main religion of these two regions. And secondarily, the use of trade and trade systems in general, while it does shift from land to sea, and while it does shift from the Silk Roads to the Atlantic Ocean, the use of trade and the benefit of trade is still a primary way in which people gain power, keep power, and build their economies. So some of the key concepts for Unit 4 that you should be aware of for the early modern period. 4.1, globalizing networks of communication and exchange. So this includes things like the Atlantic slave trade. This will have things like the Columbian exchange, right? The fact that we have a global economy for the first time. And although it may be a stretch to call it true globalization, what we are seeing is proto-globalization, right? The beginnings of a world that is becoming increasingly smaller. 4.2 is new forms of social organization and modes of production. We're leaving behind the feudal, and we're moving into more enlightened style governments, at least in Western Europe. And again, this is a focus mostly on Europe. I'm not necessarily talking about the Americas, Africa, or Asia at this moment. But we do see an enlightened period of time where we see the rise of democracies or parliamentary monarchies or absolute monarchies. And in modes of production, we see new forms of labor popping up, like the use of serfs on agricultural plantations, the use of indigenous populations working in mines in the New World for the benefit of the Europeans, or, of course, the slave trade out of Africa used on plantations in the New World. And finally, state consolidation and imperial expansion. We see this with the rise of Russia, who finally in 1462 become free from the Mongols, and so they're building and expanding and consolidating their government. And we also see that with the growth of kingdoms in Western Europe. Sometimes they'll go to war with each other over land, but we do see the rise of different types of kingdoms, whether they be parliamentary or absolute monarchies in Western Europe. So let's take a look at the first time period. The way that this section is going to go is we'll take a look at a 50-year period at each time. We've got West on the west side and East on the east side. And then afterwards, if there are any pictures that I think might be helpful for your understanding, or at least just for fun. I've got those after each date slide. So let's start with Western Europe and then Eastern Europe, and then we'll make a comment, and then we will move on. In Western Europe, one of the things that we see in this period is the decline of feudalism. Now, we know that the Black Death came around in 1347 to 1351. It had ravaged throughout the Middle East and Asia prior to that, but in Europe, those are the years, and it knocks out about 1/3 of the population. This, of course, is 50 years earlier, but by the time we get to 400, we've already experienced a series of peasant revolts and rebellions. We've got people moving out of feudal manors and gaining land for themselves, partly because there's a lot of open lands because of the amount of deaths, but also partly because they start to demand wages. And as they make money, they can start to afford living on their own instead of under the stewardship of a lord. So with the Black Death, we see the decline of feudalism and the rise of the Renaissance instead. Now, the Renaissance isn't an event necessarily. It's referred to a period of time that's more of what some historians will call an awakening, both social, political, culturally, where starting with the Italians, then moving up to the north, we start trading more with the East, bringing in new inventions. One example of a key invention that was brought in would be the printing press, right, which increased literacy rates as well throughout Europe, allowing people to start to read things for themselves. That'll get to Protestant Reformation, but I don't want to jump too far ahead. But we see this growth in trade again, and we see a renewal of spirit and energy and wanting to learn, the age of exploration, the growth of new technologies, questioning the church, being able to read, the rise of literacy. And so it's a clear departure from the medieval period to the Renaissance period in Western Europe. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, we still have Mongol rule in Russia. The Mongols had taken over back in 1241 after two different conflicts between the Mongols, which they called the Tatars, and the Russians. And ultimately, the Russians were taken over by the Mongols. While some did adopt Mongol dress, many of them tried to maintain what it was to be Russian, or at least at that point it was the Kievan Rus, right? But they don't really get their independence until a little bit after this 50-year chunk. So they're still ruled by the Mongols. Now, Ivan the Great, which is Ivan III, he does come into power in 1440, and he stays in power until 1505. So we are going to see the rise of Ivan III, who is the one who helps free Russia from the Mongols. But while the West is experiencing a time of awakening and all these new ideas, and social systems are fundamentally changing, and political systems are growing and changing, and commerce is really coming to the forefront of society, we still see a very much subjugated Mongol-run Eastern Europe, and that stunted growth is going to make itself known throughout the next couple hundred years, especially once we start talking about the industrial period in Unit 5. So, on the west side here, we see Leonardo da Vinci painting the Mona Lisa. Okay, he would be an example of a Renaissance artist. He is also sometimes called the Renaissance man because he was more than just an artist. He was a sculptor. He was a scientist. He would cut apart bodies to understand anatomy and how the anatomy worked. So he is the embodiment of what it means to go through the Renaissance, right? He was interested in a lot of things, and that interest took him very far. On the right-hand side, we see Ivan III. Oh, wrong color. On the east side, we see Ivan III, who is going to become the first new king, I suppose, of Russia once the Mongols have left. Now, if we take a look at 1450 to 1500, things start changing a little bit for the Eastern Europeans. But first in the West, we see the rise of the Northern Renaissance as opposed to the Italian Renaissance. And how it's different is that the Northern Renaissance focuses mostly on religion. Okay, we see a lot of religious changes in this period. Now, the Protestant Reformation isn't really until 1517. We'll get there, but we are going to start questioning the church because of the rise of literacy. So while the Renaissance in the South was more so about reincorporating what it meant to be Greek and Roman, rediscovering art and humanism, which is the emphasis on the human form instead of on the gods, right, which we saw a lot with the medieval period art. In the Northern Renaissance, it's more so a reaffirmation of European power using weapons and making better technologies, and, of course, taking another look at religion, which is soon going to fracture with the Protestant Reformation. What we also see during this period of time is the age of exploration, beginning mostly with the Portuguese and the Spanish. Now, we know that the Portuguese start sailing all around the coast of Africa. They're trying to find a route into India. They do get to India by this period of time. And they're also going to go accidentally and settle in Brazil. Now, the Spanish, they do a few different things. First, of course, we have Christopher Columbus going to the New World, but then we also have some Spaniards who we would call conquistadors, who want to conquer and take down these new lands to settle up new territories. And then we've got guys like Magellan who want to just sail and circumnavigate and see as much as they can. Magellan, in his quest, does end up conquering a bunch of lands in the east, or at least in the South Pacific, for the Spanish, like the Philippines and like some other islands, which are later going to be given to the Americans during the Spanish-American War, which ends in 1801. Now, if we take a look at the Eastern Europeans, the Russians are free from the Mongols in 1462, which is a good 22 years after Ivan III becomes the ruler. And what we see initially is southern expansion. The territory is not huge. Ugly, let me fix that. The territory itself is not huge, right? We're not getting a huge expansion like we see under Ivan the Terrible. But it does represent that Russia is now centralized, it's its own unit, it's consolidated, it has a military, and it is able to actually expand. So if we take a look at this map, I know this is just for Western Europe, but I still find it pretty interesting. Blue for Western Europe, right? What we're looking at here are all the explorations from the Western European countries. Red represents Spain. We can see it going down. Red represents Portugal. We can see it going down to Brazil, around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, and over to India to set up a spice trade. We see the Spanish in that orangey yellow color. We've got Columbus's voyages going over to the Bahamas, to Cuba, to Hispaniola. We see Pizarro going down from Panama into Peru, conquering the Inca. We've got Hernan Cortez going from the Caribbean into Mexico to conquer the Aztecs. Magellan going south around Cape Horn in South America, going around to the Philippines and back up. So what we're seeing is the Portuguese focusing more on trade, the Spanish focusing on exploration, but also conquering. If we take a look at the north, after the Northern Renaissance goes through and they start to experience an age of exploration of their own, we've got the Netherlands in purple with Henry Hudson. They go up into the New World, the Dutch, right? That's actually why New York used to be called New Amsterdam. It was a Dutch settlement that was later given to the British. We see England in green, guys like Henry Cabot and Henry Hudson going over, settling the Hudson Bay and creating some territories there, or at least initially exploring them. And in France, we have Jacques Cartier, who goes into Canada and sets up some territory for the French there, and then Verrazano, who goes around there as well. So, if we take a look at the next period of time, 1500 to 1550, things are starting to change a little bit more for Eastern Europe. But first, in Western Europe, we see the printing press and the rise of literacy. The printing press was created by a guy named Johann Gutenberg. And although it was not a new device, we know that he took the idea from the Chinese movable type, which came from Korean woodblock printing. It was still new enough for Europe. Think it's essentially a giant stamp, but what it does do is it enables the rise of single-page literature. Now, the first book printed was a Bible, but that takes a lot of planning. You basically have to set up each page and print it X amount of times and then bind them together later. So in an effort to get more text out there, what we see is the rise of single-page printings. Think wanted ads, think playbills, right? Think little posters to go up in the street. And they are distributed all over the place. And when you see literature everywhere, you are more apt to learn how to read it. And so we see a rise of literacy in Western Europe. This is going to lead to things like the Protestant Reformation, which is questioning the church. Starting with a guy named Martin Luther, who was a monk. He was noticing some differences between what the Catholic Church was preaching and having its people do versus what the Bible said, and he took issue with that. For example, the Catholic Church told its priests to collect indulgences from its people, saying that in order to get into heaven, you have to pay a certain amount of money, and you'll get a signed document saying that you have entrance into heaven. Martin Luther, found no evidence of this in the Bible, and he believed instead that the only way to get into heaven, based off of what the Bible said, was through faith and faith alone, not good works, not paying your way in. And so he leads a movement, accidentally really, he didn't intend to. He just wrote his grievances on a list, published it on the church. It was printed by the printing press, and changes started to sweep through Europe. And starting with him, you see a fracture in the Catholic Church and the rise of different Christian denominations, all resulting back to the Protestant Reformation. So while that's going on in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, we're still focusing on expansion. Right, this is still what is the biggest part. The territorial expansion the Europeans had done a long time before this, they were able to do because they weren't conquered by the Mongols, but because the Russian development was stunted by Mongol rule, the Russians are doing their expansion phase a little bit later than their Western counterparts. So Ivan the Terrible, so named because he killed a lot of boyars and a lot of people who he feared would take over the throne. One of the things that he did do was that he expanded into Siberia, taking over a lot of what we call Russia today, that big section to the north, which is more or less dry and arid land. But that area of Siberia was conquered by Ivan IV, vastly improving the amount of lands that Russia had and giving them access to more and different types of furs which they could trade to build their economy. Now, one of the things that Ivan IV did not do is he did not have a successor. He did not have an heir. I believe he actually killed his son. And that's going to lead to a period of time known as the Time of Troubles, where once he dies, there's no more Ivans, right, so to speak, to take over. And so we're going to see a very small power struggle until the Romanov dynasty comes into power. So while Western Europe is going through a cultural and an intellectual change and religious change, Eastern Europe is still focusing on expansion. On the west side here, we see an example of the printing press. It may not be the exact one that was used, but it's a replication of Johann Gutenberg's printing press. And on the east side, we've got Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV, over here. So from 1550 to 1600, in Western Europe, we've got things like the scientific revolution, right? And in the scientific revolution, we've got the birth of reason and logic as a way of explaining the universe. It's not just about religion anymore. We're moving away from that medieval sensibility that everything is by the church and by God and by religion, and instead we're starting to apply reason and logic to different things. Some of the people of the scientific revolution are guys like Isaac Newton, who comes up with rules and laws for motion, but also theorizes about gravity. You've got Sir Francis Bacon, who comes up with the scientific method. In order, we've got Copernicus, who spoke a lot of the old Greek idea of heliocentrism, that the sun is the center of the solar system, not the earth. Followed by Kepler, who also looked at the laws of planetary motion, and then finally Galileo Galilei, who also was looking at that, but published Copernicus's findings. So this is just a few of the many of the scientific revolution who you should be familiar with, who started to apply reason and logic to the way that things were working, as opposed to blind faith or trusting God. Not to say that they were not religious men, because most of them still were very religious men. It's just the idea of applying reason and logic to explain things, instead of just saying, well, it's unexplainable. Right? It's the unknown, and we can never know it. Well, for these guys, that wasn't enough, and they sought to know things by applying, again, reason and logic. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, we've still got Ivan the Terrible. I don't think I actually put his dates. He was from 1533 to 1584, and again, he's still expanding. Okay, so he's still existing in this time period. He's still expanding. He killed many boyars, and he didn't really have a backup plan for once he killed all these people, what was going to happen when he died. Over on the left-hand side here, we've got Copernicus, looking at planetary alignment, and our good friend Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible. A big old terrible scowl he's got going on. So things are really starting to change for Eastern Europe in 1600 to 1650. And I think I just realized that I switched colors for the last slide. I'm sorry, green is supposed to be Western Europe and blue is supposed to be Eastern Europe. My mistake. Anyway, so for Western Europe, we still got the scientific revolution, right? But towards this time period, slowly we're going to be leading into the Enlightenment. And one of the guys that you should know is philosopher René Descartes. Not Descartes, right? He's French. It's René Descartes. And he comes up with the idea of skepticism. So the idea is of applying, this being skeptical and applying rationality and law and logic to things. That's going to carry us away from just necessarily math and science, and instead applying it to things like society and politics and culture. And while René Descartes firmly fits within the scientific revolution, he's one of the ones that comes up with this idea of skepticism, which is going to usher us into the next age. Now in Eastern Europe, Ivan has died, and we've gotten to a period of time we know as the Time of Troubles, from 1604 to 1613. This is when there was no heir to the throne, and so we didn't know who was going to take over next, and it's a period of time of just not really knowing what's going on. But ultimately, the family that comes into power is the Romanov dynasty. Guys like Michael Romanov, Mikhail Romanov, and Alexis Romanov, who take over after the Ivans, and the Romanov dynasty actually stays in power until the Communist Revolution in 1917. So they're the ruling family for quite a long time, including people like Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and all of the other myths that you may have talked about, Nicholas II, right, all those guys. So on the left here we have a picture of Sir Isaac Newton, right, who came up with the idea of gravity. I doubt whether or not an apple fell on his head and he picked it up and said, "Ah, that's how it works." But that's the story we like to tell. He not only did he come up with the laws of motion, how things move, but also concepts about gravity, trying to define why is it that things fall. Right? He was one of the first to look at that. Now on the other side here we have one of the Romanovs. I believe this one is Michael. Right? From looking at this picture, we can see they're still big on orthodoxy. We can see that they have beards, and the reason why I say that is because Peter the Great is going to give a beard text later on, and this picture represents the time of troubles. So in Western Europe from 1650 to 1700, again, this is René Descartes, right? We are going to be applying the ideas of skepticism. And if you're wondering, and if it seems like Western Europe is stuck in a rut here, this is a lot of science for a very short period of time. I think we've only really looked at 100 to 150 years. These periods of time don't happen overnight, right? Applying science and changing people's minds about science, especially since you're telling them to move away from their ideas of the church towards science and reason, does take a long period of time. So what we're seeing in Western Europe is a long revolution. Revolutions don't need to be short and quick. A long revolution of thinking, of intellectualism, of culture, of science. And slowly it's going to transform into also the Enlightenment, which is the idea of the scientific revolution but applied to politics and society. Now in Eastern Europe, we've got Peter the Great. He comes into power in 1689 and he rules until 1725. Now he's got two main things. One is the idea of westernization, the idea that we are going to adopt a lot of Western culture. This is not about changing to Western European forms of government, like absolute or parliamentary monarchy. We're not doing that at all. It's not about that. It's not about adopting their religion. It's not about changing their economy to necessarily match it. But instead, it's about moving culture. Things like the ballet. Things like Western dress. The idea of having no beards. And in fact, if you still had a beard, you had to pay a beard tax because he really wanted people to resemble Western Europeans to make it easier to trade with them. But another thing that Peter the Great is known for that I should have put down here is going to war with Sweden, and after winning against Sweden, creating a Baltic seaport, a port on the Baltic Sea so that he could start sailing and trading on his own. Did that propel Russia into the forefront of colonization? No, but at least it gave Russia a port on the Baltic Sea, one that they have maintained ever since. Another thing that he does is that he moves the capital away from Moscow to St. Petersburg, right, which is still called today, and that is the Baltic seaport. Okay, it's right there on the edge, close to Finland and Sweden. So one of the things that René Descartes said is cognito ergo sum, which is I think, therefore I am, right? Which embodies the idea of skepticism. And then on the right-hand side there we have Peter the Great. Notice how distinguished he is compared to, wrong color again. Look at how distinguished he is and how Western he looks compared to, the Romanov picture that I showed you before. No beard, no hat, no typical Russian dress. Instead, he's wearing a Western-style outfit. He's got a Western-style neckerchief. He's got a Western-style sash over him, and look, and beard, and hairstyle, right? He's really trying to embody the West without completely changing what it means to be Russian, specifically political forms, because had he started to adopt some of the more enlightened ideas, he would have lost power, because he was an absolute monarch. So this last chunk of time, 1700 to 1750, in Western Europe we are experiencing the Enlightenment. So we're applying the ideas of reason and logic and Descartes' skepticism to new things. One of the enlightened thinkers is Adam Smith. He was an economist who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Which gave the ideas of laissez-faire government, the idea that the market should control the government, not states, which is a very clear departure from what was going on in some European countries. Now in Italy, it hadn't been run by the state for a long time. It was run by the merchants in the individual city-states. And so what we're going to see here is a change in Western Europe away from the idea of state-run mercantilism and instead towards the capitalist market system, which we will cover in the industrial period. Another Enlightenment thinker is feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. She argued that all of these great changes in politics and government should also be applied to women. She was a feminist thinker, saying, well, if you're going to say that all men are equal, it should be women too. There's really no difference between us as far as what we should be allowed to have under a government that's supposed to protect all of us. And one of the last ones that I want to talk about would be John Locke. There are tons of others. These are just the highlights. John Locke came up with and wrote the two treaties of government. I'll show you a picture of that next, where he came up with the ideas of everybody being equal under the eyes of the law, and the idea that the power of the government should be in the hands of the people. Right? It shouldn't be the power of one man chosen by a god. Right? We're applying the idea of logic and reason and skepticism to the whole religious aspect of this. And instead, it should be the power of the people running it, and also the people whom the government is benefiting. Now, over in Eastern Europe, we see more of Peter the Great's expansion. Now, as far as territorial gains, he goes over into the Kamchatka Peninsula, which is that last little peninsula right before we see Alaska. All right, and he's still focusing on westernization. And of course, he also moves a little bit west to claim that Baltic seaport. But while Western Europe is undergoing the Enlightenment, we still see absolute monarchy in Russia. We see territorial expansion still happening. We see westernization, an attempt to catch up both culturally, intellectually, and also economically with the West. So we're seeing a clear divide here in development. On the left, we've got John Locke's treaties of government. You may have dealt with this when you took U.S. history, and if you haven't taken U.S. history yet, well, then there you go. You will later on. And on the right, we see that Russian development. So in the pink, we see from 1690 to 1795. That encapsulates both Peter the Great and Catherine the Great's expansions. But one of the things that Catherine the Great did is she expanded over into Alaska and down into almost Northern California in pursuit of timber, but more importantly, furs. So beyond 1750, I know that the time period cuts off here, but it's still important to kind of highlight what's going on. So the Enlightenment is continuing, and what the Enlightenment is going to do is it's going to lead to revolution. The idea that no one man should have power, that there should be a system of checks and balances. There is a clear class divide which is causing issues between those with money, the higher-ups, the elite that have always had power, and those on the bottom who are now literate and who are now enlightened and who are learning that they too should play a role in government. And so we're going to see this class conflict break out into a series of revolutions. First in the United States, wanting to break away from the monarch George III. Then the French Revolution in 1789, which is a class struggle between the lower classes, which consists of 99% of the population. We're talking 97%. Most of the people, the middle class, the artisans, the merchants, the bankers, versus the church and the nobility, which you had to be born into, right? That's later going to feed over into the Haitian Revolution, which is going to spark Latin American revolutions, which in turn is going to re-spark more revolutions in Europe, including some in Western Europe. So the Enlightenment is going to lead to radical changes in political structure, which is going to be a revolution. And in Eastern Europe, we see some things happening as well, especially with Catherine the Great. She, like Peter the Great, was really into westernization and expansion. She expands all the way into modern-day Alaska, although they don't maintain that land. They end up giving it to the Americans, right? They end up selling that off. And westernization as well, just more or less continuing the policy, right? Nothing necessarily new about bringing in culture, but continuing the idea of having that link between East and West. However, one of the things that Catherine the Great is known for is oppression of the serfs. She was super anti-serf. I think she perhaps didn't want them to rise up. I mean, they made up about 90% of the population. And so she wanted to keep them oppressed. And so she would pass laws giving more power to the landlords over the serfs, subjugating them even further. And that's eventually going to lead to the Pugachev Rebellion, a rebellion led by a guy named Pugachev, which was eventually squashed, right? It didn't really go very far. The absolute monarch, very strong government of Catherine the Great was able to put the rebellion down. But it does highlight for us some of the issues that are going to start building in Eastern Europe. What do we do about the fact that there's enlightenment in Western Europe and revolutions in Western Europe, and we're going to see small ones in Russia as well? But our people are still agricultural. Our people aren't advancing. The serfs are still downtrodden, and we're living in a system where the boyars still have all the power. And ultimately what's going to happen to Russia is in 1917, after a rise of Marxism in the late 1800s, we're going to see a revolution which leads them to turn communist, which they will stay until the 1980s. So on the left-hand side here, we've got, just generally speaking, an absolute monarch, or a boyar rather, kind of trotting down on the serfs. This is Pugachev, leader of the Pugachev Rebellion. And over here we've got good old Catherine the Great. I think the fact that we had a female absolute monarch in Russia is remarkable in and of itself, although she certainly had her problems. So that's your basic chronological timeline of Eastern and Western Europe in the early modern period. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email me at any time. And next chapter and the next eLecture is going to be on early Latin America. I hope you guys have a fabulous day.